Welcome to the Nifty Historian, where we explore the most fascinating and bizarre stories from history. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest tales of medieval Europe, the story of a king who believed he was made of glass. Hit that subscribe button and let's get started. In the grand halls of medieval France, where tapestries hung heavy with gold thread and courtiers whispered behind jeweled hands, there walked a king who believed he was made of glass. Charles VI of France, once called Charles the Beloved, would spend his final decades convinced that the slightest touch could shatter him into 1,000 glittering fragments. This wasn't metaphor, this wasn't poetry, this was the terrifying reality of a man whose mind had fractured as surely as the glass he believed himself to be. Picture this. The year is 1405. The King of France refuses to allow anyone to touch him. He has iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent his fragile glass body from breaking. He screams when servants approach. He hasn't changed his clothes in months, perhaps years, because the act of undressing might cause him to shatter. The most powerful man in one of Europe's greatest kingdoms has become a prisoner of his own delusion, and with him, France itself begins to crack. This is the story of how madness seized a throne, how a king's broken mind nearly destroyed a kingdom, and how one man's struggle with mental illness changed the course of European history forever. Charles VI was born into French royalty on December 3, 1368, during a time when France was locked in the brutal 100 Years' War with England. He wasn't supposed to be king so young. His father, Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, had built France back from the edge of disaster, reclaiming territory from the English and restoring royal authority. When Charles V died in 1380, young Charles VI inherited the throne at just 11 years old. The early years of his reign were marked by regency councils and power-hungry uncles who fought over control of the young king like wolves over a carcass. His uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy and Bourbon, each saw the boy king as a pathway to their own enrichment. They drained the royal treasury, imposed crushing taxes on the people, and turned the French court into a nest of corruption and intrigue. But something remarkable happened when Charles came of age in 1388. At 20 years old, he dismissed his grasping uncles from power and recalled his father's former advisors, known as the marmosets. These experienced administrators brought competence and stability back to the French government. The young king showed promise. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his subjects. The people called him Charles the Beloved. He married Isabeau of Bavaria in 1385, a German princess who would bear him 12 children and stand beside him through the unimaginable trials to come. By all accounts, the early years of their marriage were happy. Charles was handsome, energetic, and popular. He loved tournaments, hunting, and elaborate festivals. He commissioned beautiful manuscripts and supported the arts. France, still battered from decades of war, began to hope again. But there were signs, small things, moments of strange behavior that courtiers dismissed or explained away, brief periods of confusion, unexplained fevers, episodes where the king seemed not quite himself. Looking back, historians have debated whether these were warnings of the storm to come or simply the normal variations of human temperament magnified by the pressure of kingship. Then came August 5, 1392, the day everything changed. Charles VI was riding through the forest of Le Mans with his army, heading to Brittany to punish a would-be assassin who had attempted to kill one of his trusted advisors. It was a hot August day. The sun beat down mercilessly on the armed column as they made their way through the dusty roads beneath the forest canopy. According to eyewitness accounts, a ragged man suddenly emerged from the trees. Wild-eyed and disheveled, he grabbed the bridle of the king's horse and shouted a warning. "Ride no further, noble king. Turn back, you are betrayed." The king's guards drove the man away, but the encounter had clearly unsettled Charles. Still, the column pressed on. They emerged from the shade of the forest into the blazing sunlight of an open plain. The heat was oppressive. One of the pages riding behind the king, drowsy in the heat, dropped his lance. The metal struck against another soldier's armor with a tremendous clang that rang out across the plain like a gunshot. Charles VI went mad. The king drew his sword and spurred his horse forward, screaming that traitors surrounded him. He struck at his own knights and courtiers, killing at least 4 men before his brother, the Duke of Orleans, and several knights managed to wrestle him from his horse. Charles fought them like a wild animal, not recognizing his own brother, not hearing their pleas, lost in some terrible vision only he could see. Finally, they subdued him. He collapsed, unconscious, foam flecking his lips. When Charles awoke days later, he had no memory of what had happened. He was told of the men he had killed, and he wept with genuine remorse. He seemed, for a time, to be himself again. Perhaps it had been a temporary affliction, brought on by heat and stress. Perhaps the king would recover. He didn't. Over the following months, Charles suffered more episodes. They came without warning. One moment he would be engaged in conversation or attending to state business. The next he wouldn't recognize his wife, his children, or even his own name. During these episodes, which could last days or weeks, he would become violent, paranoid, or completely catatonic. He would refuse to eat, convinced his food was poisoned. He would run through the palace, screaming about enemies who weren't there. The court tried everything. Physicians bled him, following the medical wisdom of the age. They balanced his humors with special diets and purgatives. They consulted astrological charts. Priests performed exorcisms, convinced the king was possessed by demons. Nothing worked. The episodes continued, unpredictable as summer storms. And then came the delusion that would define Charles VI forever. The belief that he was made of glass. Glass in the medieval world was precious, beautiful, and impossibly fragile. It was a luxury item, associated with wealth and refinement. Venetian glassmakers guarded their secrets jealously. To be made of glass was to be something precious and beautiful, but also something that could be destroyed in an instant, irreparably. Charles became convinced that his body was composed of this crystalline substance. He could feel it, he said, the brittleness of his bones, the fragility of his skin. Any pressure might cause him to crack. An embrace could shatter him. Even sitting down was dangerous. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect himself. He refused to travel in carriages for fear the jostling would break him. He wouldn't allow anyone to touch him. When he did consent to move from room to room, he shuffled carefully, terrified that a misstep might cause catastrophic damage to his glass body. The court physicians recorded that he would sometimes stand motionless for hours, afraid to move. He wrapped himself in blankets and furs, insisting they provided cushioning for his fragile form. When someone approached too quickly, he would scream in terror, convinced they meant to smash him. Modern psychiatrists have looked back at Charles VI's symptoms and recognized what medieval doctors could not. This was likely a severe form of mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. The glass delusion itself appears to have been a specific manifestation of what's now called somatic delusion, a false belief about one's body. Interestingly, the glass delusion was surprisingly common among European nobility and intellectuals in the medieval and early modern periods, suggesting cultural factors shaped how mental illness manifested in that era. But for Charles and for France, there were no diagnoses, no treatments, no understanding. There was only the terrifying reality of a king who believed he was glass, ruling a kingdom that was beginning to fracture. With the king incapacitated by his delusion, France descended into chaos. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. The uncles Charles had dismissed came roaring back, joined by new factions led by the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, and his cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. These powerful nobles carved France into competing spheres of influence, each claiming to act in the king's name while actually pursuing their own ambitions. Queen Isabeau, the Bavarian princess who had married Charles when she was just 14, found herself in an impossible position. During Charles's lucid periods, which became increasingly rare, he was still king. During his episodes, someone had to govern. Isabeau attempted to serve as regent, but she had limited power and faced constant opposition from the male nobility who saw her as an outsider and an obstacle to their own ambitions. The rivalry between the Duke of Orleans and the Duke of Burgundy became particularly vicious. They represented different factions, different policies, different visions for France. In 1407, their conflict exploded into violence when John the Fearless had Louis of Orleans assassinated on the Paris street. The murder sparked a civil war that would rage for decades, splitting France into two camps: the Armagnacs, who supported the late Duke's family, and the Burgundians, who backed John the Fearless. Meanwhile, Charles VI remained alive, a ghost haunting his own palace. During his lucid periods, which became shorter and rarer, he would be horrified by what had happened during his absences. He would attempt to reconcile the warring factions, to restore order, to be the king France needed. But the madness always returned, and with it the glass delusion. The common people of France, who had once called him the Beloved, now whispered that their king was Charles the Mad. They suffered under the chaos his illness had unleashed. Taxes soared as rival factions drained the treasury. Justice broke down as noble factions operated above the law. The 100 Years' War with England, which had quieted during Charles V's reign, roared back to life as English kings saw opportunity in French weakness. In 1415, Henry V of England invaded France and won a catastrophic victory at Agincourt. The French army, split by internal divisions and poorly led due to the power vacuum at the top, was destroyed. Thousands of French knights died in the mud. The English marched through Normandy, conquering town after town. Charles VI, during one of his rare moments of clarity, was forced to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This agreement was a national humiliation beyond measure. It declared that Henry V of England would marry Charles's daughter Catherine and inherit the French throne upon Charles's death, effectively disinheriting Charles's own son, the Dauphin. The treaty acknowledged that France's own king was unfit to rule and that a foreign monarch would inherit his kingdom. The treaty split France even further. Many French subjects, particularly in the south, refused to recognize it and remained loyal to the Dauphin. The kingdom was now divided not just by civil war, but by competing claims to the throne itself. Through all of this, Charles lived on, a prisoner of his delusion. The years passed. He aged, but the glass belief persisted. Court records describe how he would be found standing in corners, afraid to move, how he refused to bathe because water might dissolve his glass body, how he sometimes didn't recognize his own children when they came to visit. Isabeau, his wife, became a controversial figure. Exhausted by decades of her husband's illness and the impossible position she occupied, she allegedly took lovers and made political alliances that benefited herself rather than the crown. Historians have debated her role for centuries. Was she a victim of circumstance, doing her best in an impossible situation, or did she betray France through her agreements with Burgundy and England? The truth, as always, is likely more complex than either extreme. Charles VI of France died on October 21, 1422, at the age of 53. He had reigned for 42 years, longer than most medieval kings, but for more than half that time he had been lost to madness. His death came just 2 months after Henry V of England had died of dysentery, leaving the throne to his infant son, Henry VI. Both kingdoms now faced minority rule and uncertain futures. Charles's son, whom he had disinherited under the Treaty of Troyes, declared himself Charles VII and continued to fight for what he believed was his rightful throne. The war would drag on for decades more, until a peasant girl named Joan of Arc would claim divine visions commanding her to drive the English from France and see Charles VII crowned. But that's another story. What remained of Charles VI was a legacy of tragedy. He was buried with royal honors, but the kingdom he left behind was broken, occupied, and bleeding. The civil war he couldn't prevent continued. The English occupied Paris. France had been one of medieval Europe's great powers. Now it was a battlefield where foreign and domestic forces fought for supremacy. But Charles's impact extended beyond politics. His glass delusion became famous throughout Europe and beyond. The image of the glass king, beautiful, fragile, trapped by his own perceived brittleness, resonated as a powerful metaphor. Philosophers and writers used his condition to discuss the nature of madness, reality, and belief. How do we know we're not made of glass? How do we know our perceptions of reality are accurate? These became important questions in early modern philosophy. René Descartes, writing 2 centuries later, would use the example of mad people who believe they're made of glass as a philosophical thought experiment in his Meditations. How can we trust our senses if madness can so completely deceive us? The Glass King had become not just a historical figure, but a symbol of the fragility of human reason itself. Medical historians have studied Charles VI's case extensively. The glass delusion was surprisingly common in the medieval and Renaissance periods, appearing in medical texts from across Europe. People, usually educated, wealthy individuals, would become convinced they were made of glass and live in constant fear of breaking. Some wrapped themselves in protective layers, others refused to sit. One Dutch scholar supposedly positioned himself over a fire, believing that heating his glass body would make it more durable. Why glass? Why not stone or metal or wood? Some scholars believe it reflected anxieties about fragility and status in an unstable world. Glass was valuable but breakable, beautiful but dangerous. For people feeling vulnerable in societies racked by war, plague, and political instability, perhaps the glass delusion expressed an inner truth about their psychological state in a physical metaphor their culture could understand. Modern psychiatry recognizes such somatic delusions as symptoms of severe mental illness. Charles likely suffered from what we'd now diagnose as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or possibly bipolar disorder with psychotic features. His episodes of violence, paranoia, and catatonia, his inability to recognize family members, his persistent delusions, all point to a severe psychiatric condition that medieval medicine had no capacity to understand or treat. The story of Charles VI, the Glass King, is ultimately a deeply human tragedy, multiplied by the inhuman scale of monarchy. Here was a man who, by all accounts, wanted to be a good king. He showed promise in his youth. He cared about his people. He tried to govern wisely. And then his mind betrayed him in the most complete and devastating way possible. In a different era, Charles might have been treated. He might have had access to antipsychotic medications, therapy, structured support. He might have lived a life, if not free from mental illness, then at least with tools to manage it. But he lived in the 14th century, when madness was seen as demon possession or divine punishment or imbalanced humors, when the best treatment available was bleeding, prayer, and restraint. The tragedy extended beyond one man. Because Charles was king, his illness had geopolitical consequences. The civil war that erupted in the power vacuum of his madness killed thousands. The English conquest that his incapacity enabled devastated France. The humiliation of Troyes echoed through French politics for generations. One man's broken mind helped break a kingdom. Yet there's something almost unbearably poignant about the specific form his delusion took. Glass, that most beautiful and most fragile of materials. Charles VI, in his madness, had perceived a truth about the human condition that his sanity might have hidden. We are all, in some sense, made of glass. We are all more fragile than we pretend. We are all one accident, one illness, one moment of bad luck away from shattering. His courtiers must have watched him with a mixture of pity, fear, and perhaps recognition. This was their king, yes, but also a mirror held up to their own vulnerability. If the most powerful man in France could be reduced to this, afraid to move, afraid to be touched, convinced of his own impossible fragility, what did that say about the rest of them? France eventually recovered, of course. Charles VII, the son who'd been disinherited, did regain his throne. Joan of Arc did rally French forces. The English were eventually driven out. The kingdom was restored. But it took decades and cost countless lives, and the trauma of those years of chaos shaped French politics and culture for generations. As for Charles himself, we can only imagine his subjective experience. What was it like to believe you were made of glass? To feel your body as crystal, waiting to shatter? To live in constant fear of the slightest touch? Was there any comfort in those moments of lucidity, or did they make the returns to madness even more terrifying, knowing what was coming? The historical records tell us about policies and battles and treaties, but they can't fully capture the lived reality of mental illness, especially not across a gulf of 6 centuries. We know Charles suffered. We know he frightened his attendants and saddened his family and frustrated his advisors. We know he sometimes wept when told what he'd done during his episodes. We know he lived for decades, trapped inside a mind that had turned against him. The Glass King stands as a reminder of how fragile civilization is, how dependent on the accidents of individual health and circumstance. Had Charles VI been born in a different era, or had his mental illness been less severe, or had medieval France had better mechanisms for governance during a king's incapacity, history might have unfolded very differently. But he wasn't, and it didn't. And so we're left with the haunting image of a king who believed he was made of glass, ruling a kingdom that was already beginning to crack. Charles VI died in 1422, but the Glass King lives on. In philosophical thought experiments, in medical case studies, in the historical memory of an age when madness could reshape nations, and in the imagination of anyone who's ever felt too fragile for the world they inhabit. In the end, Charles the Beloved became Charles the Mad, who became the Glass King, a man transformed by illness into metaphor, a monarch whose broken mind reflected and perhaps caused the breaking of his realm. His story is a tragedy, yes, but also a window into the medieval mind, the nature of power, and the eternal human struggle between reason and unreason, between the self we know and the self that madness makes us become. The glass once shattered can never be fully restored, but we can study the fragments and in doing so, understand something about ourselves. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and tragic figures, make sure to subscribe to the Nifty Historian. Hit that like button and drop a comment letting me know what historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Should I explore more stories of royal madness, more medieval mysteries? Let me know below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we uncover more of history's most intriguing stories.